So I'm going to try to go through this a little more quickly than I did in the video that's online. I assume you've all had the experience of creating a piece of artwork on a computer. You're either looking at the Cintiq, the Wacom Cintiq tablet, or you're just looking at your screen doing the artwork. Then you take that artwork and you put it on a disk, or you put it up in the cloud or something, and you move it to another computer and it looks different. My sense is that this problem is not as bad as it used to be. There used to be, it seemed, much more of a variation in the way monitors looked, the way they displayed information. Things seem to be improving a little bit in terms of color consistency across monitors, but still, it happens. I mean, have any of you had it happen where you felt like it was a really dramatic difference moving it from one to another? China puts her hand up. Yeah, kind of, maybe. How about printing? I mean, I haven't had you. China puts her hand up very aggressively. Yes, things look very, very different in print than they do on screen. So this brings up the question, why is it that a certain image looks so different on different monitors? Why is it that it looks different on screen than it does in print? And basically it all comes down to just lack of calibration. There's nothing. Most people don't do anything to their computer, to their monitor, to their printer to ensure that it is displaying color accurately. And I think personally that's something that's critically important for all professional illustrators to do. So I want to talk to you about color calibration. The issue relates to this question of, why are you not working? There we go. Of what's actually real in the realm of digital imaging. And I'll get right to the point of this rather than wasting a lot of time talking about it sort of theoretically. But when you're creating a digital image, what you're doing is you're using various input devices, whether it's a mouse or a Wacom tablet or something. And even with the Wacom tablet, even with the Cintiq, I think a lot of students have the impression that they're literally somehow drawing on the screen. But what they have to realize is all they're doing is just sending a stream of data, a stream of ones and zeros, binary data, into the computer, and that's being stored in a digital file. So the only thing that is consistent when you copy that file and move the file from one computer to another, when you display it on your screen, when you send it to a printer, the only thing that's consistent is the numerical values that are stored in that digital file. So that's the only thing that's real in a digital image. It's just a string of ones and zeros stored in binary format in the digital file. The display you see on screen as you're creating the artwork is just one representation, one interpretation of the numbers in that digital file. The digital file has to be translated into voltage, which is sent to the monitor, which then stimulates either liquid crystals or LEDs or something like that to display the image on the screen. And likewise, when you send that digital file to print, the printer has to translate the numerical color values into ink that is sprayed on a paper, or color toner if you're using a color laser printer or something like that. So every representation of that digital image is simply the machine interpreting that data to display it to you either on screen or in print. So believe it or not, the whole process of scanning and reproducing color images in many ways was easier back in the old days, before it was done digitally. And the main reason why it wasn't necessarily easier from a technical point of view, but it was easier in the sense that you always had something to compare the colors to. You always had a real tangible object or image that you could compare the colors of your printed output back to that original piece. So, this is the way, this is a simplified schematic of how the scanning, proofing, and printing process worked back in the old days, where all artwork was created in traditional media. And so there was always a physical painting that you had in your hands. And you could look at the actual colors of that painting, and then you could compare that to the prints that you were making and say, okay, does this print match my original piece? So you'd start with your original image, a painting or something, or could even be, a sculpture, could be a physical object, like a piece of clothing or something. You would scan that, and believe it or not, there were actually scanners before there were computers. That might seem a little weird. It's like, how can you have a scanner if you don't have a computer to scan it into? The scanners were actually analog scanners. They used a laser to detect the colors of an image, and then they transferred that image directly to a piece of photographic film. So there were these giant things that were bigger than this table here. They were called drum scanners. And you would take a piece of artwork and you'd actually have to wrap it around a cylinder. So if it was artwork on canvas, you'd actually have to take it off the frame and wrap it around. If it was artwork that was on like a piece of illustration board, they would actually have to literally peel the artwork off of the backing of the illustration board and wrap the artwork around this big cylinder. And the cylinder would rotate, and there was a laser that would hit the artwork, and it would reflect off and expose not just one piece of photographic film, but 4 pieces of photographic film. So you could generate the CMYK film negatives directly from a physical image using one of these old analog drum scanners. And it never did plug into a computer. I mean, and all of this took place, back in the 70s and early 80s, before all of this stuff was done digitally. Alternatively, you could literally just photograph the image. You could photograph it 4 times, without having to use the laser drum scanner. But regardless of whether you used one of these old analog drum scanners or whether you just used a photographic process, your original image would then be translated into a set of 4 film negatives, 1 negative for each of the 4 color plates in the printing process. And then you could do 2 different things with those film negatives. You could generate a proof from the film negatives. And when I started in this business, I was very fortunate to work at a company that had all of this equipment. In fact, we even had one of the old drum scanners, one of the old analog drum scanners in the back of our building. They called it the boat anchor because it was completely useless. They were just going to sell it for scrap metal at some point, but we had, the more up-to-date technology, at least up-to-date, in the early 90s. And you could take these 4 pieces of film, 1 for each of the 4 printing plates, and you could essentially, through a photographic process, you could make a print where you would, I don't know how much detail I want to get into this, but you'd start essentially with a blank piece of white, glossy white paper. And they had this thin film that came in the 4 colors of the ink. So they had a thin film of cyan, and you'd lay that on the white paper. Then you'd put the cyan negative on top of that, and you'd shine a bright light through it for a couple of minutes. And it would essentially transfer that cyan film onto the sheet of paper. So it would capture all of the cyan information from the cyan negative. Then you do the same thing with the magenta, the yellow, and black. And then you composite these on top of one another. So what you ended up with was a proof that was derived from the actual pieces of film that eventually would be used to create the plates that would go on the press to print it, using ink on the printing press, on the offset press. So you see here in the picture, that diagonal arrow is pointing down to something called a contact proof. It's called a contact proof because you're laying the sheet of paper, the piece of colored film, and then the negative on top of it. They actually you had to put this in a thing with a big glass lid on it. The big glass lid would come down, and then there was a little pump that would generate a vacuum. and it would it would generate a vacuum inside this thing. It's called a vacuum frame. And it would press that sheet of glass down onto it and hold the film, the photographic film, tightly to the colored film, and then hold that tightly to a piece of paper. And so they were all pressed tightly against one another. Then you'd shine the light through. So then you have this print, and the particular technology that our company used when I was in this business was called a match print. And the match print was considered the gold standard. It was by far the best quality print that you could generate from an image that was eventually going to be printed on a press. So we would show you, these are the colors that you're going to get when you put this thing on an offset press and print it using CMYK inks. So you could then compare that back to your original piece of artwork or your original object and say, did the scanning process actually capture the real colors of this object? Is this thing actually going to print correctly, so it looks exactly like the original image? And if not, if somehow the match print didn't really match your original artwork, there were very old-fashioned but very effective photographic techniques that you could use to modify the different photographic negatives to either add a little bit more cyan or maybe take out a little bit of yellow, or you could tweak the colors using photographic processes. And then you could take another match print from a new set of photographic negatives and then compare that back to the original. And hopefully now you got closer to the colors that were present in your original object. And finally, once you're satisfied that your photographic negatives are going to yield an accurate image, then you would use those negatives to burn a set of printing plates. And when I say burn, it was the same kind of process. You'd put the printing plates themselves actually were almost like pieces of photographic film. They had a photosensitive surface on top of them. You'd put the plate in that same vacuum frame, that same big device with the big sheet of glass that would come down. But you'd put your printing plate in there. You'd put the negative on top of it. You'd suck all the air out of it with the vacuum frame, so it would press the negative tightly against the photographic plate. And then you'd use that same light source. It was very intense light. You'd shine the light through, and it would actually expose the surface of the photographic plate in a type of photographic process. And you'd actually have to run the plate through a developing solution, just like you would develop a piece of film in the old film photography days. So what you'd end up with was a set of 4 printing plates. You'd put them on the press and you'd run paper through, and of course you would start printing it. And even at that process, you could take your final printed image and you could compare it back to your original piece of artwork or your original object, piece of clothing or something like that, to make sure that the prints that were coming off the press matched perfectly with the original image. And this was particularly important for things like catalogs, printed catalogs for clothing manufacturers. If they're trying to sell, T-shirts or shoes or something, they want the colors in the catalog to accurately match the objects that they're selling, because they don't want people to order a shirt in a certain blue and then it shows up and it's way different from what it looked like in the catalog. Of course, now we have that problem. You order something on Amazon or you order anything online, and then you actually get it and it's like, wow, the color is completely off. But that's because most images on the internet are not calibrated in any way. So anyway, so that was the old-fashioned way of doing it. Now, ever since the mid-'80s, with the desktop publishing revolution, this whole process is done digitally. And of course, now we have people like ourselves who generate images from scratch on a computer. I suppose if we're talking about photographing and scanning an actual object like a shirt, you could still compare the images back to the original shirt. But if you're creating a piece of artwork from scratch on a computer, if you're creating a brand new piece of artwork in Photoshop or in Illustrator or any graphic software, that artwork never exists as an actual hard copy. It exists only in the computer. And so it exists only as a string of ones and zeros saved in a digital file. So as you create that digital file, you're seeing the image appear on your monitor, but you have to remember that what you're seeing on your monitor is just your monitor's interpretation of the numbers that you're putting into the digital file. Same thing when you're working on a Wacom Cintiq. You know, as you're drawing, you're seeing the image come into existence. You're seeing the image created, but you have to remember that it's just the Cintiq's interpretation of the numbers that you're putting into that digital file. Likewise, you know, when you go to print the image, if you print it on your own desktop color printer, you know, you have your own color inkjet printer, your own color laser printer. That's just the printer's interpretation of the numbers in the digital file. Same thing when you go to print it using an offset press, you would take that same digital file, you would send it to a device like what's called an image setter, which is essentially just a laser printer, but instead of printing on a sheet of paper, it prints directly onto a piece of photographic film to create a film negative. So when you send digital images to a laser, to an image setter, essentially you're generating the film negatives that'll be used to create printing plates. Or there's newer technology called a plate setter, where you send your digital file directly to a device that prints on the photographic plate itself and just spits out 4 photographic plates. So you skip the whole process of creating 4 sets of film negatives. But again, regardless of whether you use an image setter or a plate setter, it doesn't matter. You end up with a set of 4 printing plates, which you then put on the press and you generate a printed image. But if you have a file that was created digitally, you know, what are you comparing that printed image to? Do you stand next to the press and take one of the sheets that coming off the press and hold it up to your iPad and say, does that match? And if the printed image doesn't match the image that you created on your iPad or on your laptop, is it because the printer is wrong and the printer is not accurately capturing the colors of your image? Or is it because the colors on your iPad or on your laptop were wrong to begin with? Maybe the image looked good on your computer, on your laptop, your iPad, your computer, whichever it was. But maybe in reality, the colors you're seeing on that screen are not accurate. And so maybe the print is actually a better reproduction of the image that you created. So the solution to this whole problem is that every step in this process has to be calibrated to make sure that the prints that you're generating are accurate representations of the numbers in the digital file. And more importantly, in my opinion, the image that you see on screen as you're creating the artwork is a really accurate representation of the colors you're creating. So it's possible to do calibration of all of these different kinds of devices. So it is possible to do printer calibration. So the way this works is that you would have to buy a printer calibration device called a spectrophotometer. And this would come bundled with software. And the software would include a target image, which consists of just a series of color swatches. And you would then print the target image. And that's what you can see here in this photograph. You see that this person is holding a device over a sheet of paper that consists of just lots of little blocks of color. So what you're seeing there is the target that has been printed. And because that target was printed from the calibration software, it knows what those colors are supposed to look like. So then you use the device called the spectrophotometer, and you can see the guy's using his hand to actually scan across the image. And the spectrophotometer is measuring the colors in each of those little color swatches from the target image. So then the software compares the colors that it's reading off of the printed piece of paper, compares that to what it knows the colors are supposed to look like that are saved in the software, and it creates something called a printer profile, which is basically just a text file that compensates for any issues with the print. So if the print is consistently printing a little bit too much cyan, the printer profile then essentially sends feedback into the computer and says, okay, when you print to this printer, reduce the amount of cyan a little bit to compensate for the fact that the printer tends to print too much cyan. So you're going to reduce it a little bit to make sure that the prints are actually accurate reflections of the colors in the digital file. So the whole point is that it ensures that what actually prints matches what was in the digital file. These things tend to be kind of pricey. The cheapest ones that I've ever seen are around $450, but they go up way over that. Professional printing companies will have these things, and they'll use them on a regular basis to calibrate all of their printers. And you can even calibrate an entire offset press using this. So you would print, a bunch of film negatives, you'd make 4 plates, you'd put the plates on the press, you would print the target image on the offset press, and then you would calibrate it to calibrate that whole offset press printing process. So professional printers will have these things to calibrate their presses and calibrate all of their printing equipment. My personal feeling is that it's not necessary for an individual artist to own one of these things. You don't need to calibrate your printer for the simple reason that any color print that you make is almost always, the vast majority of the time, you're never going to send a color print to your client. They're not going to use that color print for anything. What you're going to do is you're going to create digital artwork. You're going to save it as a JPEG or PDF, send it to your client for them to just look at it and make corrections and give their approval. Once they've approved it, then you'll send them a high resolution file. So if it's a vector file, you'll send them an Illustrator EPS, most likely. If it's a Photoshop file, you might send them the PSD, but I think you'd be better off sending them a TIFF file. I would flatten the Photoshop file and send it to them as a TIFF. No point in giving them all the layers in your Photoshop file because you don't want them to be able to dissect your artwork and use bits and pieces of it. So you're always going to be just sending your client a digital file. It's very rare that you would ever generate a color print that's going to be used for anything. You might print your work in color just to put it in a file folder and keep a copy of it for future reference, just for your records. I don't do that. I don't even own a functioning color printer anymore. When I create color artwork, I'll just print a black and white copy for myself on a black and white laser printer, just to tuck it in a file folder, just so I have a permanent record of creating that artwork. So you as the digital artist don't have to calibrate your printer. You just assume that when you deliver a file to the printer or to your client, that if they're going to generate prints from that digital file, that they're going to use a reliable company to print it, a company that actually calibrates their own equipment. Now, the key thing here, though, is that you have to make sure that you're sending them a good digital file. You have to make sure that the digital file you send them actually contains the colors that you want. Because if they are working with a reputable printing company that calibrates their equipment, they're going to get an accurate print of whatever you send them. So if you send them a digital image with horrible colors in it, they're going to accurately print horrible colors. So it is the artist's responsibility to send a good file to the client. And the only way that you can ensure that you are sending a good file, meaning a file with the correct colors, to your client is if you can trust the colors that you're seeing on screen while you're creating the artwork. And this requires monitor calibration. So monitor calibration works very much like printer calibration. The difference being is that we have a target image that is displayed on screen, and you have a little device called a colorimeter, which is similar to a spectrophotometer, but there's a subtle difference. Thankfully, they're a lot cheaper. You use a colorimeter to measure the color values that are displayed on your screen. So the software that comes with the colorimeter will display a series of colors on screen. The colorimeter device measures those colors and it compares them and says, okay, this is supposed to be 255 red, 0 green, 0 blue. Your colorimeter is measuring that and says, is it really that color? And once again, it creates a thing called a profile. In this case, it creates a monitor profile, which will then allow your computer to make adjustments to compensate for any idiosyncrasies of your monitor. If your monitor is not displaying enough red, then it'll say, okay, we need to turn up the amount of red so that the color looks right. So ultimately, this process of profiling or calibrating your monitor ensures that what you're seeing on screen is what you're really saving into that digital file as you create it. These are a lot cheaper. They range in price from around $100 to about $200. My personal feeling is that every digital artist should own one of these things. Because if you don't, it's completely random chance that you're sending your client a good file or not. You may, if you're illustrating a textbook or something, you may send all 200 images off to the publisher, and they print the book and they send you the book back, and you open the book and say, oh my God, those aren't the colors that I created. It shouldn't look like that. And guess what? Chances are those really are the colors you created. It's just that they didn't look the same on your screen because your screen wasn't calibrated. Most people don't take my advice on this. I've written blogs about this, about the need for digital artists to have to do monitor calibration. I think most people are just willing to take a chance that it's going to be close enough, it's going to be good enough. So let me talk to you a little bit more about the process, since I think it is critical. So I understand why some people don't do it. I mean, part of it's just the time it takes, although the whole process, once you own the device, the whole process takes 30 minutes at most. There's the expense. People don't want to spend the money on the device, but to me, to spend $169 to buy one of these things, to guarantee that your colors are accurate, that's for me, that's less than the cost of one illustration. And I do, thousands and thousands of illustrations, hundreds in the course of a year, typically. So to spend less than the cost of one illustration to make sure that all my colors are correct before I send the files off to the printer or off to my client, I think it's a no-brainer. I think it's absolutely worth it. Because let's say your monitor is really off, your colors are really bad, and you create 200 illustrations for a textbook and you send them off to the publisher, and the publisher says, that artwork you sent to us, chances are they're going to make some proofs before they actually send it to press. They're going to proof your work just to make sure that the colors are right. And if they take a few proofs and find out that that all your colors are just hideous, they're going to send it back to you and make you redo it. And then how are you going to even know how to redo it if it looks fine on your computer? Plus just the amount of time it would take for you to redo all that artwork is just huge. So anyway, I think it's a small price to pay. The devices that are available to do this sort of work have changed dramatically over the past 20 years. I've owned one of these things probably close to 20 years now. And companies come and go. There've been a couple of other companies that used to make these things and they've disappeared. Even though I think this is critically important, I just don't think there's enough people out there actually buying them. So it's hard for some of these companies to stay in business. The only company that's been consistent for over 20 years is Data Color. And they've gone through a whole series of devices called Spiders. Originally, I owned a Spider 3 that I probably got close to 20 years ago. That lasted for a long time. Eventually, it got to the point where the operating system just didn't support it anymore. And they didn't release an upgrade to the software for it. So I was forced to buy a new one. I still have the Spider 3 at home. It works fine. It's just that it won't run on my computer. So then I had to buy this one, which is a Spider 5. Now they're up with the Spider X. Actually, I'm not even sure that's up to date. That's from a year ago. They've probably changed the names of their models again. So yeah, the Spider 5 was probably about the same price as the Spider 5 Pro that they're selling now, you know, somewhat under $200, $150, $169, somewhere around that range.
Just the elite thing that the Pro does that
makes it $100 more. Interestingly, the device is identical. The colorimeter is exactly the same. The only difference is the software. And we're going to get in a few minutes, we're going to get into a discussion about some of the settings that you have to choose in these devices. There's a setting called gamma, and there's a setting called white point or color temperature that you have to choose before you proceed with the calibration process. And they're very important settings. The Spider X Pro gives you a small range of choices for these different settings. So gamma, typically there's like 1.8, 2.0, 2.2, maybe 2.4. There's a range of a few settings. And so I think the Spider X Pro gives you like 3 or 4 choices of gamma setting. And then for things like white point or color temperature, there's things like 5,000 Kelvin, 6,500 Kelvin, 9,000 Kelvin. There's a range of things. And I think the Spider Pro lets you choose from like 2 or 3 of those settings, the most common ones. And in my opinion, that's all you'll ever need. The Spider X Elite lets you customize both the gamma and white point settings and choose from a continuous range of settings. So if you wanted gamma 1.93 and a white point of 6,100 Kelvin instead of 6,500 or 5,000 Kelvin, you could choose that. There's no reason why any artist would ever need that kind of customizable settings. That's the main difference between the Pro and the Elite. Is just the user customizability of things like gamma and white point settings. And I think the same thing is true with the Pantone version. So we talked about Pantone colors before when we were talking about spot colors, you know, the Pantone matching system. So the same company that makes those Pantone colors of ink also makes their own line of colorimeter devices. Now this is one of those companies that's changed though. X-Rite used to be an independent company, and then Pantone bought them and purchased their products. There used to be a third company called Bretagne Macbeth. They seem to have just vanished completely. They don't even exist anymore. So Pantone makes this thing called the Color Monkey, which I've never cared much for the name. But that does what you need it to do. It has, you know, certain preset settings, like you can choose gamma 1.8, 2.0, 2.2, and you can choose from the standard color temperature settings. Whereas their i1 Display Pro also gives you full range of customizable gamma and white point settings. So let's talk about those settings for a minute. So the basics of color calibration are simple. You hang this little device on your monitor, you display a series of colors, and it measures the colors and compares them to what it knows the values are supposed to be. And so it fixes your display so it's displaying colors accurately. But there is more to the process that you need to be aware of. Before you actually go through the calibration process, you have to choose two important settings. And it's helpful to know what these settings mean so that you can make intelligent choices about these things. The first thing you have to choose is something called gamma. Gamma is a measure of contrast on your screen. And it relates to the fact that when you want to display an image on your monitor, you have a set of numbers that are stored in the digital file. You have the color values of the individual pixels. But your computer has to translate the numerical color values that are stored in those pixels. It has to translate that into voltage, which is sent to the monitor to make the little LEDs glow with a different color. So there's a very simplified formula here on the slide. It says voltage equals the pixel value raised to an exponent called gamma. This is a way oversimplified equation. It's really more like voltage equals some sort of constant times pixel value raised to the gamma. But in a sense, the voltage that is generated from the pixel values is it's an exponential relationship, where the pixel values are raised to this gamma setting, this gamma exponent. So what that means is that if you have a small value of gamma, a difference in pixel value is going to translate into a small difference in the actual voltage. So a small difference in pixel value will translate into a very small difference in the way the color displays on your screen because it's controlling the voltage. If you have a very large value for gamma, because it's an exponent, and the pixel values are raised to that exponent, a relatively small change in pixel value is going to translate into a larger change in voltage because it's raised to that power. So imagine the difference between, 2 raised to the third power, 2 times 2 times 2 versus 2 raised to the fourth power, 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. It's a whole factor of 2 difference, in the result of this mathematical function. So, to put it simply, a small value of gamma is going to give you smaller differences in pixel value, which in reality translates into lower contrast. So your differences in voltage are going to be smaller, and therefore the differences in value that you see on screen, the differences in light and dark and bright colors versus dull colors, are not going to be as pronounced because you've got a smaller gamma value. And as you increase the gamma value, it means that the image on screen appears more contrasty, more variation between light and dark. So the gamma value, interestingly, is tied very closely to the operating system that you're using on your computer, because it's the operating system that's actually translating pixel values into voltage and sending that information to your monitor. So when the Macintosh computer was first introduced in 1984, it was intended from the very beginning to be a desktop publishing computer. It was meant to be a graphics computer for people to create images that were eventually going to end up in printed form. And so when Steve Jobs and the folks at Apple designed the original Mac, they chose to use a gamma value of 1.8, which they found meant that any changes in pixel value that you saw on screen matched what images looked like when they were printed on paper. So they chose a pixel value specifically that would allow the image you see on screen to closely match what was printed on paper. In a sense, printing on paper also has a gamma value because the pixel values, the numerical values of your pixels, somehow have to be translated into ink on paper or toner on paper if you're talking about a laser printer. So there's essentially an inherent gamma value in that printing process as well. So Apple made sure that the gamma of their on-screen display essentially matched the gamma value of printing something on paper to make sure that what you see on screen is what you get in print. There was a term that used to be used very widely, referring specifically to the Mac operating system, WYSIWYG. Anybody ever hear of WYSIWYG? It's an acronym for what you see is what you get. And it just meant that whatever you saw on screen is what you were going to get in print. In fact, the history of the development of the Mac is quite interesting because when they released the Mac in 1984, it wasn't just, oh, here's this computer and we think it's going to be good for desktop publishing. Apple actually was collaborating with a whole bunch of other companies to all release a series of products at the same time to essentially create, the desktop publishing revolution. So not only did they release the Macintosh computer, but simultaneously, there was a company called Aldus that released a program called PageMaker, which was the very first desktop page layout program designed for combining text and images on screen. So Aldus released that at the same time to coincide with the release of the Mac. Apple also released their first laser writer printer, which was the first commercially available laser printer on the market. They didn't invent it. I think Canon actually invented laser printer technology, but Apple was actually the first company to actually sell one commercially. Also, Apple was collaborating with a company called Linotype, which makes image setters and things like that for high-end professional printing. They introduced the very first version of their thing called the Linotronics, which was the first digital image setter. And so the whole point was that on this new Mac, you could create a page layout in Aldus PageMaker. You could send it to your own desktop black and white laser printer, the Apple Laser Writer. And then once you were satisfied with the way it looked in print on your own laser writer, you could then send it to the Linotronics machine to generate photographic film to create photographic plates. And they would all look the same. What you see on screen would match what you saw in your laser print, which would match what was sent to the image setter, which would then match what you saw, when it was printed on an offset press. And another little bit of trivia here. Sorry to get off on a tangent, but I enjoy this kind of old computer trivia. Apple needed a way for the computer to communicate with the laser printer and to communicate with the Linotronics image setter. They needed essentially a computer language that would allow that page that you see on screen created in PageMaker to then be sent to different kinds of printing devices. So Apple utilized a product called PostScript, which was the very first product produced by a brand new little company called Adobe. PostScript was the very first product produced by Adobe. It was their page description language. So it was a computer language that's what it was designed to do, was describe the size and shape and placement of objects on a page. So PageMaker utilized it to position objects on page, and then also to describe that same imagery to send to different kind of printing devices. To again, ensure that consistency. So, Apple, Aldus with their PageMaker product, using Canon's technology to produce a laser printer, working with Linotype to develop the Linotronics, and then working with Adobe to develop PostScript. all of this was all released as one package in January of 1984. And that's really what created the whole desktop publishing revolution. One of these days, I'll tell you a story about PostScript too. By the way, when I have you save files in Illustrator, I usually have you save it as EPS, which stands for Encapsulated PostScript File. It's still using that old PostScript language.
I was just going to ask, like, in the form is PostScript still being used? So you just answered that.
Yeah, it's still the basis for all of the objects that you create in Illustrator, all the vector objects. It's the basis for PDF file that the Acrobat format uses, is all based on PostScript. Now, of course, Mac was introduced in 1984. At this time, Microsoft was still making DOS, which was just a command line program. They didn't have a graphical user interface. And of course, Bill Gates saw the Mac operating system and famously said, I want this. And they started scrambling very quickly to create their own competing product, which of course became Windows. It took them a couple of years to get Windows off the ground. But once they released Windows, Microsoft also had to make the same choice. What gamma setting do we use? And Windows was never intended to be an operating system for desktop publishing. It was designed for business uses, and it was targeted to sort of a mass consumer audience. And later it became sort of the preferred platform for a lot of games and stuff like that. But always geared towards sort of a mass consumer market as opposed to, being geared towards actual graphic artists. So Microsoft made the choice that when they released their Windows operating system, they would use a higher gamma value, a gamma value of 2.2, which actually is very similar to the gamma value that's used in television broadcasts. Television is very high contrast medium. And so Microsoft decided that they wanted their operating system, they wanted all images that appeared in Windows to have that very high contrast that matches what you see in a television broadcast. And so this, even though there's not that big a difference between 1.8 and 2.2, it's enough of a difference because it's an exponent that it translates into a pretty significant difference in contrast in the screen. So Windows images tend to always be more contrasty than the same image on a Mac. Now, I do have to say that this was true up until a few years ago. And then Apple made a decision, which I think was a very poor decision, frankly. They decided that they would give in to peer pressure and change their native gamma setting to 2.2 also. Because I feel like it was a bad decision, because I feel like on the one hand, they abandoned their traditional base of support among graphic artists, and they were kind of pandering to the mass consumer market. It's like, okay, we give in, we're going to make our computers look like TV video games also. All right, so, but when you calibrate your monitor, you still have to choose one of these settings. And there's also a setting of 2.0, which is kind of like halfway in between, which some people use that. The other setting that you have to choose is color temperature, sometimes called white point. And let's see how I can describe this best. So there's really no such thing as pure white light. Essentially, all white light has a little bit of a color cast to it. And that color cast can be described by a theory that was put forth by Max Planck back in the 1800s. He developed his theory of what's called black body radiation. It's a theory from physics. It's not something that exists in reality. It's a theoretical construct. but it turns out it's a very useful theoretical construct for describing the way that you generate light from an object. So in Max Planck's theory of black body radiation, he said, let's imagine an object that is completely black, meaning an object that absorbs 100% of all light that hits it and doesn't reflect any light. Now, it turns out there is no such thing. It's a theoretical construct. It doesn't exist in reality. You can't have, no matter how black something may be, it's always going to reflect some light. It can't be 100% pure black. But he said, okay, just in theory, let's imagine that there was such a thing as an ideal black body that absorbed all light that hit it. As you heat that body up, as you heat up that black body, because of the excitement of the atoms that make up that object, they are going to begin to emit light. Just imagine any object that you heat up in a flame. You see the object begins to glow. You know, you put a piece of metal into a campfire and it'll start to glow. You know, steel doesn't normally glow, but when it gets hot enough, it starts to glow and it emits light. So as you begin to heat this ideal black body up, it's going to glow and emit light in different wavelengths. And he was able to calculate that if you had this ideal black body and you heated it up to 2000 Kelvin, so there you've got the Kelvin, technically it's not a temperature scale, but it is sort of a measure of temperature. I won't get into the physics of it, but you know, 0 Kelvin is absolute zero. That's the temperature at which the motion of all matter stops. And what are we at standard temperature and pressure? We're like 275 Kelvin or something like that. I'm looking at Xian like she should know. You should know this, son. What's standard temperature, pressure in Kelvin? I think it's like 276 or something like that, Kelvin. So like, you know, sitting here, we're at 270 something Kelvin, I think. But so you take this black body and you start heating it up hotter and hotter, and it begins to glow. And when it reaches 2000 Kelvin, it glows orange, kind of like the light that comes from a candle or from a campfire or fire in your fireplace or something. If you keep heating it up to a hotter temperature, 2500 Kelvin, this is like the color of an incandescent light bulb, just a regular old-fashioned light bulb that you'd screw into a light socket. So it's not pure white. There's a yellowish glow to an incandescent light bulb. By the time you get up to much higher temperatures, 5000 to 5500 Kelvin, this is like the daylight looking over the horizon, or a lot of typical office lighting. It still has a slight warm cast to it. Not these, because these are fluorescents. But you know, like a lot of office lighting that still uses incandescent lighting, it'll still have a very slight warm cast to the light. 6500 Kelvin is like Rochester. It's an overcast gray color. There's almost a slight bluish cast to the light, with that kind of gray overcast look. And then as you get up above 6500 Kelvin, you get into light which is actually quite blue. The white actually has a bluish cast to it, very much like television broadcasts. Television broadcasts are anywhere from 6500 to 9300 Kelvin. And that means that the white in a television broadcast actually has a very distinctive bluish glow to it, which you don't really notice so much when you're watching the television. But you know, this is going to sound kind of creepy, but if you're ever driving down the road and you look in people's windows and you see that blue glow coming from their living room, you know they're watching television. What what's interesting about this is that the color temperature of white light is exactly the opposite of what we normally think of as being warm and cool colors. We think, as artists, we think of cool colors as being, blues and greens, because they remind us of things that are cool, like water and ice. For us, warm colors are things like orange and red, and even yellow, because we associate them with things like fire. But in this theory of black body radiation, it's just the opposite, where something that is glowing at a relatively low temperature has a very warm cast to it, reds, orange, and yellow. And as you increase the color temperature, the object begins to glow more of a bluish color. And you can actually confirm that yourself if you've ever looked closely at a gas flame. If you have a gas stove by any chance, you look at the flame, the center of the flame is blue. That's the hottest part of the flame. And then it becomes yellow, and then it becomes orange out on the fringe of the flame, where it's a little bit cooler. So this color temperature business is related to monitor calibration because, once again, every computer has to decide what color white it's going to use. Is white going to be a warmer white with a lower color temperature, or is the white going to be a higher temperature, which is going to give it a bit of a bluish cast to it? So every computer has to make this decision about what color of white they're going to use. And by the way, keep in mind that when we say that television emits white light at a very high temperature, it doesn't mean that the television is literally 6,300, 6,500, or 9,300 Kelvin, because your house would burst into flames. It just means that the color of light that's produced is the same color that would be produced by Max Planck's ideal black body if it were heated up to that temperature. So the different operating systems also historically, in the past anyway, used different color temperatures. Once again, because the Mac was designed from the very beginning to be a desktop publishing computer, they decided to choose a color temperature of 5,000 K, also sometimes referred to as D50, which is designed to simulate the appearance of reading a book under normal office lighting conditions. So the appearance of white on the Mac was meant to look like reading a book on a piece of white paper under normal office lighting conditions. Whereas when Windows was released, they made the decision to go with a much higher color temperature, 6,500 K, also known as D65, which again, just like their choice of gamma, was designed to simulate the appearance of television. So, when you sit down at a Windows computer, if you haven't changed any settings, by default, it's going to look like you're watching TV. It's going to have that same blue glow to it. So you have to choose one of these settings. So you have to choose a setting for gamma and a setting for white point or color temperature. These days, if you read publications on this subject, and there actually are books out there about color calibration, books about color management. There are people here at RIT in our school of what do they call it now? Used to be the School of Print Media, but now it's School of Media Sciences or something. It's part of College of Art and Design. Most of them will say, "Oh, you should just choose 2.2 gamma and D65, the higher gamma and the higher color temperature." But I don't agree with their reasoning. I feel like their reasoning is they're just kind of throwing up their hands and saying, well, everybody uses D65 and 2.2 gamma, so we should all use it. And we want to try to make our colors match people's monitors, for when they're looking at games and web pages. Here's the problem I have with that. even if you choose the same gamma and same white point setting that every Windows user out there is using, everybody using Microsoft Windows, chances are they're all using really crappy monitors. I mean, the average person does not invest a lot of money in a high quality monitor. They buy whatever cheap piece of junk came with the monitor. China's agreeing with that. And so you have no control over what kind of color those people are seeing. Even if your gamma and white point settings match their gamma and white point settings, their monitors are still not going to be properly calibrated. And so you have no idea what they're going to see in terms of colors. You could make the most beautiful image with perfect color and have your monitor perfectly calibrated so that the image looks exactly like you want on your screen. But when that image is then placed on the internet and people all over the world are viewing it on all kinds of cheap, crappy monitors, you have no control over what they're going to see on their end. Personally, I recommend still sticking with the Mac standards. Even if you're on a PC, you can change these things. I recommend sticking with 1.8 gamma and D50 because, forget about all those people who are going to be viewing your image on the web. Like I said, you can't control what they're going to see anyway, because their images are all going to be out of whack because they're all working on crappy monitors. What you can control, though, is how your colors are going to look in print. So if you have your monitor properly calibrated and you're seeing accurate colors, and you send that file off to a printer who's also using properly calibrated printing equipment, which they all should, any professional printer should calibrate their printing equipment, you know that the colors that you're going to see in the printed image are going to match what you see on screen. So for this reason, I think it's important to avoid cheap calibration devices. And I forgot to mention this back on the slide where I was listing some of the color calibration devices that are on the market. I had the Spider X Pro and the Spider X Elite. ColorVision used to make a cheaper version of their Spider. It was called the Spider X Express. And interestingly, it was still the same device, just different software. And what I didn't like about the software with the Express was that it had a fixed setting of 2.2 gamma and D65, and you couldn't change it. Likewise, Pantone used to sell a product called the Pantone Huey, which I always thought was a silly name. The Pantone Huey also has a fixed gamma and white point setting, 2.2 gamma D65 white point, and you couldn't change it. So I don't recommend buying the really inexpensive versions, if they even still make them, because you can't customize the gamma and white point settings. So that's why I recommend things like the Spider X Pro or the Pantone Color Monkey Pro, whatever it was called. So if you are in the market for one of these things, if you actually are willing to spend the money on one, just make sure you read the specifications, make sure that it says that you can actually change gamma and white point. So, all right. So that was kind of a long, not terribly exciting talk about color calibration. I know this stuff is kind of dry. Let's take a break and then I'll actually do the calibration process for you, demonstrate it for you. I'm trying to tuck you over in a little corner here, the Zoom window. I'm gonna hide that, close that. So I have a piece of software on my desktop, and I think, Helena, you'll probably be able to see this. There's a little piece of software here called Spider 5 Pro. I'm gonna double click that to launch the software. Oh, by the way, another piece of an answer to your question. about how often to calibrate. As you'll see at the end of the calibration demo, the software actually lets you set a reminder, and it'll, you can set a reminder for every 3 months, every 1 month, every 2 days, or whatever it is, and it keeps popping up. I don't know if that shows up on the projector here or if it shows up on Zoom, but periodically in the course of our demos in this class, I'll get my little warning popping up saying you're overdue for your calibration. All right, so I'm going to start the software. Click OK. It's asking me to update. How about let's do that later, because I don't want to take the time to update the software at the moment. Okay. So gives you a little checklist here. It says, warm up. Have you allowed your display to warm up for a half hour? Because interestingly, one thing I do know for sure is that monitors change appearance just based on how long they've been turned on. Even this was much more true for the old cathode ray tube monitors back in the past, but even with LCDs and LED displays, they change a little bit as they warm up. So they don't want you to perform the calibration on a monitor that you just turned on. And so we want to check the lighting conditions, because the ambient lighting in the room can actually influence the calibration process. They want you to reset your monitor settings. Now, that doesn't work so well on the Mac, because you don't really have user controls for your monitor on the Mac, but a lot of like third-party monitors, you actually have buttons on the monitor that let you change certain settings. And then plug in our spider. So it's gonna guide us through this process. We go ahead and click next. It asks, are we calibrating a desktop computer or a laptop? And in this case, it's a laptop. Select the manufacturer. So this is an Apple laptop. Laptop model. Well, it's not a Samsung. What is this thing? So MacBook Pro. That tells me yeah, it's MacBook Pro. I would have thought it would come up with a little pop-up list. When you choose the manufacturer, you'd think it would come up with a pop-up. You could choose from different models. All right. So here's where we choose our settings. And as I said, the cheaper calibration devices don't give you this option. But and then the more expensive ones, the Spider 5 Elite or the Spider X Elite, would give you like a full range of customizable settings. But for Gamma, it says 2.2 is recommended because that's what all the experts recommend, but I disagree with the experts. You can see that we have 4 different choices here. I'm going to switch to Gamma of 1.8. And I'm curious if it's going to actually change the appearance of my screen right away when I do this. Okay, no, it hasn't changed that yet. At some point, when I complete this process, I'm going to have you guys come over behind me to actually see the before and after. And Elena, that's the part that you probably won't be able to see. I'm going to set my white point. Again, they recommend 6500 or D65. I'm going to switch mine to 5000K. Notice there's kind of an intermediate. It's like, well, it's kind of like a Mac, kind of like a PC, kind of in between. I think that's wishy-washy. I'm going to set that to 5000. Brightness, I don't think we need to change that. I'm just going to leave it by the default. And then room lighting, they don't want any direct light shining on the calibration unit, because that'll alter the calibration process. I mean, if I set this to room light on, it's going to try to compensate for that. This isn't bad. It's pretty dark over here. I turned this light off intentionally, the one on our end. So I'm just going to leave that off and not make any compensations for room lighting. But if you do have a lot of lights in your room where you're working, especially, God forbid, you have a spotlight right over your computer, that's like the worst possible thing. So you want to make sure to turn those off. No, I don't recommend working in a room that's completely dark because I don't think that's good for you. But you should actually calibrate it in the same conditions that you would be working in. So what you really don't want like a direct spotlight over your workstation, no matter what. And again, when you go to these real high-end design studios and high-end printing companies, I don't know if any place does this anymore, but I remember back in the day when I used to do this kind of pre-press stuff, we would visit a couple of these companies that did this really kind of high-end scanning, printing, graphic design kind of stuff. They went so far as to have all of the walls in the building painted a 50% neutral gray. And they actually had hoods over the monitors. In fact, there used to be a brand of monitor called the LaCie monitor, which was considered the flagship, the best possible monitor you could get for any kind of critical color work. And it came with a big built-in hood to keep ambient light off of the surface of the monitor. So, I mean, there are extremes that you can go to, but basically you just don't want strong lighting shining right on your monitor while you're working or while you're calibrating. All right, so we've chosen our settings. We're going to click next. Now I have to place the spider right there. First, I got to plug it into the USB. I want us to place it first. So, Helena, I don't know if you can see this. I'm going to show it to you in the little video here. So I'm holding up my little spider gizmo, and it actually has a little door on the back that pops off. So it separates into these two pieces. This little door over here in this hand serves two functions. One is it protects the sensitive optics on the inside of the colorimeter device. But the other thing that this little door does is it acts as a counterweight. So I can simply hang this over the top of my monitor and position it correctly. So I'm just going to hang this over the monitor. Now, right now, my spider is not laying flat against the monitor, which means I have to tilt the screen back a little bit more and maybe play around with my little counter thingy here. But you want it to lay right flat against the surface of the screen. The older spider models used to come with suction cups on the bottom. And those were great if you were calibrating an old-fashioned CRT monitor because it had a glass screen. But they would warn you, don't put the suction cups on an LCD or an LED display, especially LCDs, because LCDs are literally liquid crystals. The suction cup would stick on the surface of the liquid crystal display. And when you pulled the suction cups off, it would literally suck the little crystals into one little spot and create distortions on your monitor. So they just got rid of the suction cup feed altogether and said, okay, it doesn't matter how many times we warn people, they still stick the suction cups on their LCD display. So they finally get rid of the suction cups. But I've got my screen tilted back enough that, of course, now you can't see my face hardly, but the screen is tilting back so that the spider is laying flat on the surface, right on that little target. So now at some point I got to plug it in. Let's plug it in. And then click next. And so now it's going through the calibration process. So it's going to display just a series of colors on screen. And I imagine, Helena, you'll be able to see the differences in color. Right now, it's just pure black. But believe it or not, I think it's beginning to calibrate the reds. Just right now, it's like, using RGB, it's like, a very, very low level of red. Now you can just barely see it start turning more red. And it's going to go all the way up to full 255 red eventually. And it knows what each of these colors is supposed to be, and it's reading it. And this takes a few minutes to go through this. Because it's going to do this with red, then it's going to do it with green, then it's going to do it with blue, and then it's going to do it with neutral grays also. measuring completed. I can now remove the little spider device, close the little lid. And then I click the finish button. And so now it's asking to create a profile. So using the information that it retrieved, from doing the calibration process, it's going to save that into a text file called a profile. And like I said, what that profile does is it just makes tweaks to the way the monitor displays to compensate for the fact that it's either showing, too much green or too little red or too, whatever the issue is. So I can give it a name. What some people do is they actually put a date in here so that they know when it was actually calibrated. And what is the date today? April 13th. Okay. So 04. So we can save that. And here's where you can choose your calibration reminder. And I have mine set to every 6 months because I don't calibrate this one very often. But I mean, you can see that you can set it to remind you as often as every day to recalibrate. I think that's way overkill. So I'm just going to leave this one set to 6 months. And I'm going to save my profile. All right, so we've created a profile. It's been saved. And now we have this little target image that displays a series of different colored images. I don't know if I can enlarge this or not. Let's see. Nope, it just moves around, doesn't enlarge. But it allows us to compare the calibrated view with the uncalibrated view. So right now, what you're seeing is the calibrated view. This is probably not going to be visible to Helena, and it may not be visible on the TV screen in here. So why don't you all come around behind me at this point, and hopefully you can see over my shoulder and actually see the color image on my screen, so we can compare the current calibrated version with what it looks like prior to calibration. So I'm gonna switch it to the uncalibrated view. Okay. Now, part of the difference may be just the settings that I chose, the 5,000 Kelvin and the different gamma setting. But when I look at this uncalibrated view, especially when I look at the skin tones of this woman in the top row, I feel like she looks a little gray. I think there's a little too much blue in this image, which is giving her skin tones a kind of a gray, what we call an ashen look, almost like she's a little sick. And this church or whatever this thing is down here, in the second row from the bottom, the sky almost looks, I mean, it looks fine. I mean, like if I took that photograph, I'd be like, oh, this looks good. But when you compare it to the calibrated, all right, something weird going on. All right, so it did change to the calibrated view. I just feel like that church, the brick looks warmer and richer. I feel like the skin tones in the woman look more natural. And looking at this from an angle, it's going to be hard. I'll switch it to your view because you can't see these. Oh, you want to? I'll go over there. Okay, that works.
Right.
I was going to switch it back and forth, but so again, we switch. Here's the calibrated view, which I think the skin tones look good. The church looks good. There are things that we call memory colors. It's like when you look at it and it doesn't look right, you just know it doesn't look right. Like blue skies and green grass. If a blue sky, if there's too much red, the sky looks purple, and that's just not natural. If there's too much yellow, it looks green, and that's not natural. So you can immediately tell, and skin tones are one of those things. Even though there's a lot of variation from one person to another in skin tone, you can still tell when somebody looks too gray or too pink or something like that. So again, this is the calibrated view, and here's the uncalibrated view. And it's a pretty big change. And if I switch back to calibrated, it might give me that weird error message again. I don't know what's going on with that. I guess I have to upgrade the software, but I just think that looks a whole lot better. And And now I've done this, and I've looked at my own work. And one of the great things about doing a lot of work for print is, I'll have a textbook and I'll just hold it up next to my monitor and say, yep, print in the book looks like what I'm seeing on screen. So, all right, we got another chat message here.
Oh, well, I can't see it.
Oh, I can tell over here on the Zoom. You can. Oh, good. Good. I'm glad you can actually see a difference on your end. Very good. Okay, so that's the calibration process. So it's built a profile which is saved in there, and it'll stay in there until the next time I do the demo in a year. So then I just click next. Yeah, we don't need to look at that. It actually shows us a gamut view. Yeah, which you don't need to worry about any of that. But all right. All right. So I hope I've convinced you of the value of doing this. These devices work on Macs and PCs. Doesn't matter what operating system you're on. I think when you buy the device, this doesn't come with any kind of disk or anything. So I think you have to download the software, as you do with most software these days. As long as you have some basic understanding of that gamma and white point stuff, even if you don't understand the physics behind it, at least if you know the settings to choose, then the process of calibration is really quite simple. The gizmo does all of the work. But that's all I have for you guys today, unless you have questions about this or about your projects.
Is this PowerPoint available? That one that you showed with the settings, is that available?
I can put it up there. I don't know that I put the PDF on my courses or not.
I only see the video.
The video, okay. Yeah, I can put. I have a PDF of the PowerPoint that I can put up, which would probably be better than watching a whole hour-long video of me talking again. I don't blame you. I wouldn't want to watch it either. Yeah, I'll take care of that right now. I'll put the PowerPoint up.